Five Nights at Freddy's. I really don't think that this game needs any introduction given just how long it's been around and the fact that anyone clicking on this video should hopefully know a bit about the first game at the very least, and same goes for the title. I've seen a lot of videos pop up recently that attempt to quote-unquote fix FNAF as a whole or just its most recent outing security breach, but the whole idea of fixing something just never really set right with me. I might agree that this franchise has taken a lot of objective missteps and could be taken better care of, but, especially in the case of security breach, I really just don't think you can say that you're fixing a game when the game was intended to be the way that it was, bugs aside. Hence why I'm dubbing this a redesign video, one that combines my opinion with the groundwork that is FNAF 1 and creating something new. And with that said, let me throw out some general ground rules that I'll follow to try and make the series feel way more coherent. Rule number 1. I cannot change any lore that the games blatantly state or show. I can expand upon fan theories that I think could work as ideas that aren't fully explored to their fullest potential, but the aim of these videos isn't to change the congested lore of the franchise, it's to change up the individual games some. Rule number 2, I will not redesign any animatronics unless I feel like they completely missed the mark. I feel like most of the animatronics in the series are designed in a way to fit the job that needs to be done, with only a few notable disappointments coming to mind. The main reason I'm mostly limiting my design input is because, again, I'm focusing more on the game side of things. If I let my imagination just run free and redesign any animatronic I please, then these videos would just be way longer than they needed to be, and change things just for the sake of it. And rule number 3, I cannot add whatever characters I want into whatever game I want. For example, I can't just throw Springtrap into FNAF 1 just because I feel like it. Only characters that are shown to be somewhere at some point will be included, like how the puppet is shown to be in the FNAF 1 location in the cutscene in the second game. Alright, 3. Just 3 simple and effective rules are going to be put in place so these videos can be more grounded. And now that those are set up, let's finally get into the meat of this video. As it is, I'd say that FNAF 1 is definitely one of the stronger FNAF games. Not just in terms of its presentation, but in terms of its gameplay as well. It still has its fair share of problems, but first let's talk about what the game has as it is. Among all the FNAF titles, FNAF 1 definitely feels the most grounded in reality. The location feels authentic, there's a smaller amount of animatronics that can go from innocent to menacing with proper lighting and good camera angles, and the ambience is just really good and some of the best that the series has to offer. The gameplay is way more balanced than a lot of other FNAF games too, where RNG is present but doesn't determine if your run is going to be good or not. RNG as a whole is something that other entries would use to an extent as well, which worked wonders in some cases and abysmally failed in others. But the only RNG in FNAF 1 that affects the gameplay is just when specific characters will move around. You see, FNAF 1 only has 4 animatronics: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. You could count Golden Freddy as a 5th enemy since he can kill the player, but since he's just an Easter egg, I'm really not. And speaking of Easter eggs, that's the other RNG dependent element that the game uses. During each night, certain cameras can change to look different or the player can start hallucinating, which is a result of RNG. This type of RNG, however, does not affect the gameplay loop. Going back to RNG related to the animatronics, each one of them has an AI level that can be set anywhere between 0 and 20. Around every 4 to 5 seconds, the game will randomly pick a number between 1 and 20. If the number is equal to the animatronic's AI level or the AI level is greater than the number picked, then the animatronic gets to move. If not, then the cycle repeats itself. When an animatronic's AI is equal to 0, then it's impossible for them to move. Add an AI of 20 on the other hand, an animatronic can move at every possible time and makes things way harder than it needs to be. If you want some more specific information on how this AI system works, there's a great video breaking it down by tech rules that I have linked below. The important thing to remember is that each animatronic has their own unique path to the player, which I'll touch on more later. But now that I've explained how these enemies work, let's move on to the location that they and the player are stuck in. The pizzeria has 11 cameras positioned around the location, and each one can be used to monitor where one or more enemies are. These cameras cover the show stage, party room, backstage, bathroom, hallway, Pirate's Cove, the kitchen, supply closet, front end of both hallways, and the back end of both hallways as well that are practically right outside the doors. The only camera that doesn't allow the player to see anything is Cam 6, aka the kitchen. The video feed is disabled in the room and only audio can be heard. This was an attempt at implementing an audio mechanic, as both Chica and Freddy can be heard when they're in the kitchen even if the camera isn't being used. And speaking of camera usage, let me touch on the last current gameplay element that I want to discuss: power management. Each night the player starts off with 100% power, which can be used to check the cameras, use the door lights, or to close the doors. Using cameras is pretty self-explanatory, but using doors and door lights are very different. When either Bonnie or Chica has made their way to a door, they can be seen using the door light right before attacking. Closing the door prevents them from killing the player, but because using a door uses more power, it is important for the player to close the door only when absolutely necessary. Power automatically drains every few seconds, and the time between power drops only decreases with each night, so it's important for the player to ration out the power carefully. When using any of the previously mentioned features, the rate at which the player's power drop will increase while said feature is in use. For example, if I had both the doors closed and was sitting on the cameras, I would be using the maximum amount of power that I could be using at once, and the rate at which I would be losing power would be extremely fast. This type of situation is one that the player should avoid at all costs, but sometimes it's just impossible to get around given where the animatronics are. And with all that said, let's finally get into some of my changes that I would make to FNAF 1's gameplay. To begin with, I felt like the camera system and the building design could be spiced up some. The pizzeria is pretty good as it currently is, but it's really missing a few components that I think could make the gameplay more interesting and make the location feel a little bit more authentic. So here's my brand new layout of the place. Added an arcade with a prize counter, an employee lounge, a standard office for like the manager of the place, and I also drastically changed the layout of certain pre-existing rooms, so let me explain why. For starters, it always felt extremely unnatural to me that the pizzeria would have these two massive hallways that lead to both office doors. These hallways are obviously there just for gameplay purposes, but it still just feels really weird when you look at the map. So I got rid of them. The security office is now all the way to the right side of the map. The hallways are now both much smaller and now connected to the employee lounge and prize counter respectively, which while still a bit unnatural on one end, still feels a little bit more natural to me than two giant hallways connected to the party room. I also did away with all the hallway cameras so it's easier to lose track of the animatronics, which makes using the door lights all that more important. To make room for the arcade, I moved the bathroom south of the party room, with a supplies closet connected to the bathroom hallway now, as it makes way more sense than being across the building from the bathrooms. The kitchen has also been moved to make room for the employee lounge, as it is now at the bottom left of the map. I added an employee lounge as it felt like a more natural room to exist within a pizzeria, and was a more fitting room to connect the security office to than a kitchen. The standard office also exists as a spot for the manager to work in, or a spot for the revenue to be kept. And lastly, I thought that filling up the only dead space in the bottom right corner of the party room would be a good idea, so I created a corner for the only new addition to my FNAF 1 roster, the puppet. As I mentioned earlier, the puppet is shown to have been in the FNAF 1 location, so this doesn't go against my ground rules. This brings our roster of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy up to 5, which I think would help make the gameplay of FNAF 1 more interesting. While I previously praised FNAF 1 for being one of the better balanced FNAF games, I do think it suffers a bit in terms of boring the player, especially during the later nights after all the animatronics have been introduced. This is mostly because FNAF 1 suffers from one massive problem, having an optimal strategy. Obviously players are going to have to find the best way to play the game after all the mechanics are thrown their way, but when it becomes easier to repeat the same 5-second cycle for the entire night, which is almost 9 minutes long might I add, the game becomes extremely dull and repetitive. So my solution to remedy this problem is throwing the puppet into the mix. Let's delve into how this design choice would change up the gameplay, as well as discuss how the animatronics would all behave in this new map. Bonnie and Chica attack the player from the left and right hallways respectively in the original game, so they can still approach in similar manners in this redesigned map. Bonnie can gradually make his way to the player's left door, and Chica to the player's right. If you're curious as to where they would specifically move to go to the security office, I'll have a demonstration of their pathing on screen right now. Since there aren't any cameras really close to the doors like there were in the base game of FNAF 1, it would require the player to rely on their door lights even more to know when to close the doors. Freddy would still function almost identically, with the only difference being him moving to different spots to get to the right door and not going anywhere near the kitchen. Foxy would still require the player to consistently check the cameras to keep him at bay, and would run down the hallway at cam 6 when the players fail to do so. However, I have an interesting design twist here. I still think this camera render from FNAF 1 looks really cool, since it obscured Foxy's face and the only thing you can see are his body shape and eyes. In my redesign, Foxy's face wouldn't actually be revealed until his jump scare, when it's already too late. Foxy has 2 faces before rushing the office, and each one has its own render. The first render could be changed from Foxy's face to having Foxy's hook slightly pulling the curtain back, and the second render could stay put as it is. Then he could rush the office like I had previously described, but the player would only be able to see him from the back, so when they see the jump scare and see his face for the first time, it would be way more interesting and impactful. With the main cast out of the way, let me finally talk about the puppet's impact on the gameplay. The puppet would reside in the music box on Cam 1D, the puppet show. When it comes out of the box, it will decide to make its way to either Cam 2, 3, 8, or 9, or the backstage, supply closet, office, or kitchen if you prefer that. These are the rooms highlighted in blue on my map, as each of them has an electrical fuse box or something along those lines in them. If the puppet makes it to one of those rooms and has enough time, it can sabotage the fuse box and completely cut the player's power to 0% instantly. Normally when the player runs out of power, Freddy Fazbear himself shows up at the left door and plays a song before attacking and ending the run. When the puppet cuts out the power, however, I want things to be way more unexpected. If the puppet completes its task, then Freddy isn't the one who greets the player, it's the puppet. Imagine just sitting in a completely dark room by yourself in the middle of the night, and you see this thing poke its head in the doorway before it attacks you. To prevent dying to the puppet, I thought it would be interesting to bring the character back to its FNAF 2 roots and incorporate the music box jingle. And know why I'm not suggesting alternating between Foxy and Whiting the music box. What I will suggest is having the ability to play the music box on every camera like the audio lures in FNAF 3. Instead of trying to lure the enemy to a specific spot, however, the goal is to use the music box on the same camera the puppet is currently on. This would calm it down and send it back to its box temporarily. Playing the music box on a camera the puppet isn't on, however, will only encourage it to move faster. And if the puppet reaches one of its destinations, the player would only have a few seconds at most to react before the power is drained. The only other noteworthy aspect I'd like to add is how the puppet works when it enters the kitchen, which is a camera with no video feed and audio. I think it would be interesting to have the puppet make some sort of noise when entering the kitchen, which would make the sound mechanic go from convenient to way more of a necessity. The final big change I wanted to make to FNAF 1 was the 6th night. Each FNAF game has 5 base nights and an extra challenging 6th night, which normally isn't anything special aside from slightly different endings or a small piece of lore. Well, I think 6 nights in FNAF games should be way cooler than they currently are. The player has just beaten what they expected to be the hardest night in the game, so why not throw a real wildcard in for the 6th night instead of just night 5 but harder? My change here is simple: hallucinations to the extreme. FNAF 1 will occasionally throw hallucinations in the player's face in the form of Freddy and Bonnie's face and the text reading "It's me," but it happens way too much and it loses the flair quickly. In addition to making the hallucinations we already see occur less consistently, I think Night 6 could be a great time to really show the player some of the lore. The animatronics on the cameras could cut between looking like they normally do and looking like the kids that actually possess them, and the jump scare could be replaced by a more human-sounding one. It would put the player way more on edge after they thought they had experienced all the fear that the game could dish out, making for an awesome ending to the main campaign of the game. Custom Night could say the same as the 7th night, with the addition of the puppet of course. The only other minor change I would add would be trimming the night length, but other than that, I don't have anything else I want to change about FNAF 1. It already has strong, immersive sound design, well-designed enemies, and some interesting leads about a much larger story. Combine that with my redesign, and I'd like to think we have a more engaging and potentially scarier experience than base FNAF 1 offers. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any questions about how any aspect of my redesign functions, please ask me in the comments below. I would be happy to answer you. I'm really looking forward to turning this into a series, because if I could change this much about one FNAF game that's already higher on my list, then I cannot wait to see what I could come up with for something like FNAF 2. Unlike then, I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you people later. Blart,